So that's the nature of Revelation. So because I think we tend to, Revelation is, I think, associated with Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on our door and pointing out how various things that are happening now are the signs that Revelation is coming to pass. What Northrop Frye points out is that Revelation has always been coming to pass. The Apocalypse, that was how it was originally written. It is, if you like, what's underneath the screen of history. In high contrast, if you like. And I'm just going to read a passage about Babylon, so we know where we are for later on. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-coloured beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet colour, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. And then the angel goes on to explain that the 7 heads of the beast are 7 mountains, which is often taken to mean that Babylon, in this case, is Rome. The book was written under the Roman emperors. And I'll just read. There's one other passage which is a reference point that we need, which is the fall of Babylon in the following chapter. And the kings of the earth, who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her, shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning, standing afar off for the fear of her torment, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour is thy judgment come. And the merchants of the earth shall weep and mourn over her, for no man buyeth their merchandise any more, the merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones, of pearls and fine linen and purple, and silk and scarlet, and all thine wood, and all manner vessels of ivory, and all manner vessels of most precious wood, and of brass and iron and marble, and cinnamon and odours and ointments and frankincense, and wine and oil and fine flour, and wheat and beasts and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves and souls of men. And the fruits that thy soul lusted after are departed from thee, and all things which were dainty and goodly are departed from thee, and thou shalt find them no more at all. The merchants of these things which were made rich by her shall stand afar off for the fear of her torment, weeping and wailing. And there's a reference a bit later on where it says, there's a reference to, and they cast dust on their heads and cried, weeping and wailing and saying, Alas, alas, that great city wherein were made rich all that had ships in the sea by reason of her costliness. For in 1 hour is she made desolate. And there's a bit at the beginning of this chapter, which is the only other piece I'd like to quote, which is, an angel comes forth, and he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become the habitation of devils and the hold of every foul spirit. Babylon the Great is fallen is a quote from Isaiah. And if I read you a little bit from Isaiah, you'll see that we're gradually, by a spiral path, approaching a bit closer to Bob Dylan. Prepare the table, watch in the watchtower. Eat, drink, arise, ye princes, and anoint the shield. For thus hath the Lord said unto me, Go set a watchman, let him declare what he seeth. And he saw a chariot with a couple of horsemen, a chariot of asses and a chariot of camels. And he hearkened diligently with much heed. And he cried, A lion, my Lord, I stand continually upon the watchtower in the daytime, and I am set in my ward whole nights. And behold, here cometh a chariot of men with a couple of horsemen. And he answered and said, Babylon is fallen, and all the graven images of her gods he hath broken unto the ground. Well, Dylan's song, All Along the Watchtower, is basically a recasting of that bit of Isaiah, and it's the one song, in fact even more than Like a Rolling Stone, it's the one song that Dylan now almost always does in concert, and it's usually the end of the show, partly because it just gives the band a chance to rock out, but it also, I think, sets all of Dylan's work in context, which is another persistent theme, I think, is the theme of the end, or apocalypse. It can be the end. It's interesting that his first album is full of death, but quite soon once he started to write songs, they began to be full of apocalypse rather than personal death. There was always the sense, and I think there always has been a sense, and part of what lends Dylan's work its immediacy is the sense that it all takes place at a time of apocalypse, a time of unveiling, a time of crisis. Even when they're sort of apparently blues, fairly simple blues songs, you get the sense that the world in which they're taking place is a world that's cracking open, and that's a recurrent theme. But certainly that, as I say, he's put All Along the Watchtower kind of in the middle of his work, and it's a prophecy about, or the last part. How does the last verse of All Along the Watchtower go? All along the watchtower princes kept the view, while the women came and went, barefoot servants too. Outside in the distance a wild cat did growl, 2 riders were approaching. The wind began to howl. We assume that what the wind begins to howl is Babylon is fallen, is fallen. So Dylan became a biblical artist very early on, which is something I'd like to know more about. And the biographies I've read don't really. He was brought up fairly Orthodox Jewish. I mean, he went to the synagogue. He had religious instruction at the synagogue. He was bar mitzvahed at 13. His parents were both, active in the Jewish community there. So he was brought up fairly, obviously, a believing Jew. And yet, he starts singing about Jesus on his first record, and even by his second record, he's obviously knows his New Testament surprisingly well. There's a reference at the end of A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall, when he says, I'll stand on the ocean until I start sinking. And I think if you ask sort of most general Christians, approximate Christians, or people who are brought up in a Christian culture, who walks on the water, I think virtually everybody will be able to tell you that Jesus walked on the water. If you say who else walks on the water, I don't think most people do know. I mean, do most people know who else walks on the water in the New Testament? St. Peter also walks on the water, but only until he starts sinking. When he sees Jesus walking on the water, he says, if you call me, I'll be able to walk on the water too. And he steps out of the boat and starts walking on the water, but then starts to sink, and Jesus comes and saves him. He says, why did you not believe? Why did your faith fail? So for Dylan to quote that, it sounds incredibly egotistic. So I'm going to stand on the water. I'm going to walk on the water like Jesus. I'll stand on the ocean until I start sinking. It's actually an open question, but you'd need to know your New Testament fairly well. So it's interesting that Dylan, at the age of 22, I don't know. I'd like to know how much of the New Testament you would know if you were Jewish, coming up in the American education system. How much you would just absorb, or how much he must have absorbed it personally and with a fair degree of intensity, to be dropping in pretty precise references like that. There's another one in the end of With God on Our Side. He says, and now as I'm leaving, I'm weary as hell. The confusion I'm feeling ain't no tongue can tell. The words fill my head and they fall to the floor. But if God's on our side, he'll stop the next war. This image of his kind of head, the words kind of filling up his head and bursting. In the previous verse, he'd mentioned Judas. The verse before, which is the kind of crisis of conscience in the song, he says, I can't think for you, you'll have to decide whether Judas Iscariot had God on his side.